Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this final session of Love in the Time of Crisis. I'm James P. Barbieri, Associate Program Director here at the Power Center, and I will be your host for today. As a host, I'm here to help you, so any problems, technical or not, feel free to let me know in the chat. To open today's session, we are once again honored to have Cambridge poet Richard Barangarten with a reading of one of his poems. I'm just going to bring it up now.
Hello again, this is Richard Barangarten in Cambridge in England. At the start of the final session in this series of webinars for the Power Center in May 2022, I'd like to say what an absolute pleasure and privilege it's been for me to recite a little poem at the beginning of each of these sessions. And I'd like to thank Maureen Doolan and Eleanor Peat very much for inviting me to do so. And it's a special pleasure to read a poem at the outset of Will Buckingham's talk, which has the intriguing title of Strangers on the Threshold, which fascinates me in itself, and all the more so because Will has written in his introduction that he's going to be referring to the work of the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. Now, Levinas happens to have been an enormously powerful influence on my writing. I should say is still an influence on my writing and an inspiration. So I hope that this poem is in some way relevant, even if tangentially. The poem I'm going to read is called This Scintillating Night. It's a sonnet, as you can see, with 14 lines, and it comes from a book of mine entitled Notness. Notness is, and you may be amused to find this out, is an anagram of the word sonnets. Now, I'd like to say a couple of other things about the poem too, 3 things. First, it's partly a response to Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, who in his great book, the Pensées, his thoughts, published in 1670, wrote one particular aphorism that has become very famous. Le silence éternel de ces espaces infinis m'effraie. The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me, terrifies me. So that's what he felt when he looked up at the heavens. My response is rather different, and of course informed by the understanding of modern physics, the understandings of modern astronomy and modern physics. Secondly, the poem is also a response to Matthew Arnold's great poem, Dover Beach, published in 1867. And you may remember that in this poem, Arnold is speaking to his beloved, and he says, "Ah, love, let us be true to one another." And this is in the middle of a sense that there is chaos whirling all around, and that all we have, all we can hold on to is love towards one another. I'm not sure that I agree entirely with that, but there is an echo of Arnold here. Finally, I have the image of a face in this poem, and that very much resonates with the philosophy of Levinas, because as far as he's concerned, it is in the face that love is most truly to be found, the face of the other, and particularly the eyes of the other. I apologize for such a long preamble, but I hope you'll find it helps, or it's of interest in the long run. Here's the poem. This scintillating night. This scintillating night is filled with subtlest variations of light. They interlace and cancel like expressions on a face, yours in this case. How curiously we're blessed witnessing this, as if being called, addressed directly on this huge dimensioned base by all the puzzling splendor of time, space that placement and momentum might attest. Let us be true then to each other's love, though what we'd track in passing can't be touched, scarcely discerned in those far heights above. And though we pass like shoals of arrows clutched by wind in soaring flight and lightning flecks in sentient transience here, all things connect.
Thank you so much, Richard, for the reading of this beautiful poem, and also a huge thanks for your continued work and for introducing all of these sessions throughout this series. It's been a beautiful gift that you've given us. For this session, we are honored to introduce our speaker for today, Will Buckingham. Will is a writer from the UK with a PhD in philosophy and an MA in anthropology. He was previously Associate Professor of Writing and Creativity at the De Montfort University, Leicester, and Visiting Associate Professor in the School of Literature and Journalism in Sichuan University. He now works as a freelance writer and is on the visiting faculty at Parami University, Myanmar. Today, Will talk to us about strangers on the threshold, love, wisdom, and the task of philosophy. So before we start, I'd just like to give a few guidelines for this session. Firstly, if you can please mute your microphone just to ensure good quality audio, but at the same time, please do keep your camera on as it creates a nice environment. During this session, please do use the chat. During the session, we'll have some interaction, 2 or 3 points during the session, which the chat will be used, so feel free to use it. We may even have some Q&A, which if you do want to ask a question, please use the raise your hand function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen under reactions. And finally, this session is recorded for archival purposes, and you should all receive the recording for this in a couple of days. So with that, I'll pass it straight over to you, Will. Welcome.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you also, Richard, for that terrific opening poem, which was an absolute delight. Behind the scenes, before all of you joined and had that sort of extraordinarily expansive sonnet, there was a kind of frenzy of technological breakdown here, so which was ably sort of shepherded through that by James, but also the poem has kind of reset, set the mood over here, which is good, and so I kind of feel ready to launch in. So apologies for the short delay, but hopefully from now onwards the gods of technology should look more kindly on us. Okay. So just to check whether the gods are doing that, can you all see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay, good. So what I'm going to be talking about today is, as Richard said, I'm going to be talking about Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas, a philosopher I love very, very deeply, and I'm also deeply frustrated by at times, as with all great love affairs, maybe. And also I'm going to be talking about the idea of the stranger and the Levinas's philosophy of the strangers, but also my own obsession with what it means to connect and reconnect with strangers. So I've been thinking and writing about strangers for a long, long time. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And my most recent book, Hello Stranger, draws together a lot of those threads and explores really this complex set of relationships we have with people who aren't us or who aren't our intimates or those who are familiar to us. In this talk, I'm going to move between philosophy and storytelling. I quite like to see philosophy as a kind of storytelling and also storytelling as a kind of philosophy. So we'll be moving between the two. There may be a few philosophical rocky waters, choppy seas ahead, but also hopefully we'll be able to navigate through those with enough kind of ease and without too much crisis of our own, so that by the end of this talk, I hope that you'll be able to take away some deeper sense of what Levinas, this fascinating and one of the great ethical philosophers of the 20th century, what he has to tell us and to teach us. Hopefully some more insights into what it means to live in the world of strangers and to connect and reconnect in the world of strangers. And hopefully also a kind of sense of what that might mean practically as well. So philosophy ultimately has to have some kind of practical, has to feed that practically into human life, I think, otherwise what's the point? I mean, it might be fun, but actually if it's going to be of any deeper value, it needs to feed back into human life. So I'm going to split this talk into three parts. I'm going to start out by laying a bit of groundwork. I'm going to be looking at what it might mean to take a more philosophical perspective on human experience and this experience of strangers. Then I'm going to plunge a bit more deeply into the thought of Emmanuel Levinas. Now, he is famed for being a famously difficult philosopher, but also I think you don't have to make it more difficult than it is, and it's with Levinas, what's difficult is partly the language in which it's expressed, which you can change. But once you get beyond the language, then in some ways he's quite easy to grasp once you see what's going on. And then the only difficulty is the fact that what he's trying to tell us is incredibly challenging. It's a more, if you like, existential human difficulty he presents us with. So we'll have a look at Emmanuel Levinas and some of those issues and problems and questions. And then we'll move on at the end to look at what it means to encounter strangers, how these encounters may matter even more in a time of crisis. The title of this talk, it comes from Emmanuel Levinas himself. So, or is inspired by. So Levinas was a thinker who talked about philosophy not as the love of wisdom, but as the wisdom of love. And for Levinas, in a sense, it's a love that has priority, and we'll find out what that means later. And then wisdom is, in a sense, what you do with that, what follows after that. Okay. But to begin, I'm going to start by reading a section from my most recent book, Hello Stranger, which I think should set the scene for our discussion and for the explorations of the next couple of hours. The other thing I think it should do is it should root the philosophy in one particular concrete human experience, and I think that's a useful thing to do. The reading is about a tension between two ideas. The first idea is that grief is a loss of the future. It's a stopping up or a paralysis. So the poet Naya Marie Ait wrote, "We have no hope for the future in grief. We can neither imagine nor sense the future anymore. We can't see an hour, a quarter of an hour, a minute ahead. We cannot make plans. We find ourselves in a futureless time." So this is the first idea to get hold of, grief as the stopping up of the future. And the second idea is that in our encounters with strangers, And this is an idea, as we'll see, that comes direct from Levinas. We encounter new futures and new possibilities. So keep this tension in your mind between grief as the stopping up of the future, strangers as bringing us new futures, as I read this short passage. Loss tears a hole in the world. It exposes us, leaves open the rent, a gap. It is disorientating. It puts the compass points of our lives in disarray. Loss makes the future impossible because it refers only to the past. But loss is never total, and sometimes into that gap or that rent, the breeze of newness can blow. And in the acknowledgement of our brokenness, in the softness of it, a stranger reaches out to embrace you, and in this embrace is a bridge to something new. The relationship to the stranger, the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas once wrote, is a relationship with the future. Several days after my partner Ellie's death, I was walking down the high street. My bike had just been stolen from outside the station, and I was raging inwardly at the thief's inconsiderate timing. To the thief who stole my bike, I posted on Facebook, "You could have chosen a better time, you could have chosen a better bike." In the street, I was stopped by a stranger, a charity fundraiser. She was in her 20s and had an open, optimistic face. "Hi," she said, "you look like a friendly person. Can you spare a minute?" I hesitated. I saw the logo on her tabard. She was fundraising for breast cancer research. "Do you know much about breast cancer?" she asked. I could have lied. I could have brushed her off. I felt a constriction in my throat, but then I thought I might as well tell the truth. "Yes," I said. "My partner died in the hospice earlier this week." The stranger paused to take this in. "What was her name?" she asked. The question surprised me. It was the simplest of questions, and it seemed like a gift. "Ellie," I told her. She smiled and reached out to touch my arm. "You need a hug," she said. Then she put her arms round me and squeezed me hard, her plastic tabard crackling. A hug of solidarity, a shared acknowledgement of the difficulty of living. "Thank you," I said, crying into her shoulder, utterly overwhelmed. "Thank you so much." Okay, so that's a little opening story there. And we're going to come back to the story later, but I'm telling it now because I think it highlights many of the themes that will be central to this talk. It's about grief, and it's about crisis, it's about vulnerability, it's about Levinas, of course, who we'll be talking about today, and it's about how strangers bring us unexpected gifts and unanticipated futures. They also bring us unexpected troubles, of course, and we'll get onto that too. To put this in a bit more context, I'll say a little bit about my own concern with strangers. So from a very early age, I lived in a house that was both a public building and a private home. So my father was a priest, and therefore people turned up any time of the day or night. Sometimes, they had big issues on their hands, and they wanted to talk. Sometimes they were there for meetings. Sometimes they just kind of turned up and hung around and you had no idea what they were doing there. But we were quite used to, as kids, being kicked out of our bedrooms because somebody was staying the night, or coming downstairs and finding the house full and finding that there were strangers milling around in the kitchen when you wanted to go and get yourself a glass of juice or something. And that became quite that was home for me. So home was only only partly separated out from the world. It was porous. It was permeable to the world. And later on in life, and I talk about this in the book, at the age of 18, I traveled to Pakistan, and again, I became very interested there by hospitality. It was a hard lesson to learn. I was a very skinny and in some ways very naive and vulnerable 18-year-old teenager at large in Pakistan, traveling from small town to small town on my own. I had been teaching English for a while, and then I went off traveling. And people were immensely kind, and they hosted me and they invited me into their homes and they looked after me. And this was a huge challenge, this recognition of my dependence upon strangers and negotiating questions of safety and security and my own vulnerability was something that had an incredibly strong effect. And this is something I talk about as well in the book. I went on and trained to be an anthropologist. I got a taste for being a professional stranger. And then I fell out of anthropology for various reasons, which I don't need to go into now, fell into Buddhism for about a decade and lived in Buddhist communities. And in many ways, that was a replication of the same kind of public-private thing that I was experienced with from having grown up in a vicarage. Eventually, I met Ellie, my long-term partner, and she was also, like me, an atheist child of the clergy. We moved into a house together. We suddenly felt that in this little house in Birmingham in the UK, that there wasn't enough coming and going, so we opened up our home to strangers, and we with the couchsurfing website online, and we had probably over 120 people over the years who just came, strangers, and stayed without paying anything, but just on the basis of hospitality. And then when Ellie died in 2016 and I didn't know what to do with myself, I did two things. And the first thing I did a week after her funeral was decided the best thing I could possibly do, despite all my desire to fold in on myself, was to open my home up to other people. And I'll come back to that right at the end of the talk. And I also decided that maybe, slightly crazy idea, but maybe what I needed to do to start to reconnect with the world was to become a stranger myself. And I went and worked for 6 months in Myanmar, where I'd never been before, and dealt with being a stranger, wrestling with a strange language in a culture that was very strange to me. And that was, again, a massively sort of transformative experience. So this question of how living alongside, among strangers can shape one's life is something that's always been with me. But I'm going to pull on one thread of that, and that's a philosophical one. Because sometime in my 30s, I started reading Emmanuel Levinas, whose work is kind of obsessed by the idea of the stranger. And he talks about this as obsession. That's not my hyperbole, that's his. And he was preoccupied throughout his career by questions of what it means to encounter strangers or to encounter the essential strangeness of others. So I eventually did my PhD on Levinas, and he's been massively influential in terms of how I thought about what it means to exist as a human being, what ethics is, and what it means to encounter strangers. So Levinas is an interesting kind of character. Here he is in old age on the slide, holding forth. But he was born in Kaunas in Lithuania on the Baltic coast in 1906 to a Jewish family. And he was brought up in Lithuania and in the Ukraine. He left Lithuania for Strasbourg in 1923, and he went to study philosophy. And there he became very good friends with the mysterious Maurice Blanchot, the novelist and philosopher who remained a lifelong friend. Famously, Blanchot was almost never photographed, which, for somebody who lived throughout the 20th century is kind of amazing. And he died in the 2000s. But Levinas, so Blanchot's great friend, he then went on to study in Germany, and he studied phenomenology, and we're going to spend a bit of time talking about phenomenology, getting to grips with what that is. And he studied with Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. And then he introduced pretty much phenomenology, this strange tradition of philosophy, into the French-speaking world by translating his mentor Edmund Husserl's Cartesian Meditations into French in 1931. So this kicked off a huge enthusiasm for all things phenomenological in France, and the likes of Merleau-Ponty and Sartre as well, all eagerly read this stuff and started developing this tradition along their own lines. By 1939, Levinas had become a naturalised French citizen, and then war broke out and he became a translator. But when Germany invaded in 1940, he was captured. Now, Levinas was Jewish, but because he was a prisoner of war, he wasn't sent to the concentration camps, although many in his family were. He was put in an internment camp, and this became the foundation for his early philosophy about labour, fatigue and work. So he lived in the camp throughout the rest of the war. His wife and daughter were sheltered by his friend Maurice Blanchot at considerable risk, and after the war, the war ended, and he resumed his study of philosophy outside of the camps, obviously, and by this time many of his family had perished, had been killed by the Nazi regime. After the war, Levinas turned more explicitly to Jewish thought, and he studied the Talmud with the absolutely fascinating Monsieur Shushali, who's an incredible figure, a wandering Jewish philosopher who is almost like he doesn't exist. Nobody knows quite where he's from or what his biography is. He pops up and disappears. I mean, he did exist, but it's almost impossible. Nobody's actually managed to write a true biography of this odd, fascinating character. But he became a teacher of the Talmud to Levinas, and Levinas kept these two strains going. On the one hand, he taught philosophy and wrote philosophy. On the other hand, he wrote in more explicitly Jewish works, which he kept separately from the philosophy, although the obsessions and the concerns were very much the same, and it was more the mode of expression that was different. Okay, so that's Levinas. And in this sort of first section, I'll say a little bit more about the tradition he came from, this tradition of phenomenology, because once we get hold of what phenomenology is, then we can get a sense of what Levinas is up to, and this will help lead us through the rest of this exploration of strangers. So the Western philosophical tradition has always been obsessed by this split between what things appear to be like and what they actually are like. So reality, the essence of things, how things essentially are in themselves, and phenomena, how things appear. So Thales, the pre-Socratic philosopher, said that the reality is that all is water. So that's the noumenon, or the essence of things. And the phenomena is the appearances of how things seem to be. They don't look like they're all made of water, but somehow obscurely for Thales they are. So there's a split between how things appear to be and how things actually are. Probably more on the money, the ancient philosopher Democritus said everything's actually made up of atoms and void. So that's the underlying reality, but then there's the appearance of all these incredible things that we see around us. So this distinction between appearance and reality became one of the central distinctions in the Western philosophical tradition. And Socrates got in on it, particularly when it came to ethical questions. So the great stonemason philosopher who rambled around Athens, annoying the hell out of people by asking them questions like, what is justice, what is piety, until they'd had enough, because nobody could really answer those questions, and they eventually put him to death. So when Socrates asked questions of people like, what is justice or what is piety, he wasn't wanting them to give examples or show the phenomena of ethics. He was wanting to get a clear definition, to get to the essence of what makes justice justice, to what makes piety piety, and so on. So again, there was this split between appearances, the multifarious appearances of things, and the underlying reality that somehow we might be able to grasp. And this goes on throughout the Western philosophical tradition. Kant argues you can't get to that underlying reality at all. Our mechanisms of perception, if you like, to simplify too much probably, mean that we can never get beyond our perceiving of things to the thing in itself. We can't know it directly. So we are left with phenomena, but we can explore the necessary conditions of our knowledge and so on. That's Kant. We're not going to go down there. But crucially, Edmund Husserl is the philosopher who's really important here. And in the 20th century, Husserl was fed up with this distinction between appearance and reality, with the idea that philosophers spend their lives chasing after this underlying reality and can never get there. So philosophers always talk about getting to solid ground, and they've failed. Nobody's managed to do it. They're still arguing about the same stuff they were arguing about in time of Socrates. So Husserl said, okay, I'm going to take a really kind of bold gamble here. Let's say we forget for a time being about how things are in themselves. Let's stop worrying about noumena. Let's bracket out those ideas. And let's look at the structures of experience itself. And this, he was kind of strongly influenced here by Kant, but takes it further. If we can pay attention to how experience is structured, how it's necessarily structured, maybe we can start to build a truly rigorous philosophy. So in the 20s, Husserl was saying we lack a rational science of humankind and the human community, meaning we can't agree on things like ethics and politics and all the important stuff, because we can't agree on the basic fundamentals of those questions like what is justice and what is truth and what is goodness. So maybe if we can start from just describing the necessary structures of experience with as much rigor as we can kind of find a back door into those more fundamental questions. So phenomenology for Husserl was a kind of descriptive science. It's a direct investigation of our experience, an attempt to rebuild philosophy from the ground up. Now, in this, it completely failed. Okay, Husserl, in his claim, philosophy was a mess, and he thought that phenomenology might tidy it up. And actually, by the mid-30s, at the end of Husserl's life, he was admitting that this dream of philosophy as a rigorous science was over. Phenomenology hadn't tidied up the mess of philosophy so much as compounded it. So from Husserl's point of view, this phenomenological method had failed. But from another point of view, it made the big old mess that is philosophy messier in ways that were wildly and richly productive and fascinating. It gave rise to a burst of philosophical creativity. So we're going to just do a little bit of phenomenology now, and just see how maybe phenomenology might be a productive strategy. And we're going to do it with some help from Ella Fitzgerald. There she is. So this should make this distinction between those different philosophical questions, the chase and the quest for noumena and the exploration of phenomena, a little bit clearer. So philosophers like Thales, like Socrates, were traditionally concerned with questions like what is X, questions of essence, what is justice, what is virtue, so on. And so this is a question that down in the present age, 20th century, Cole Porter also found himself asking, and Ella Fitzgerald asked over and over again on various records that I've got stacked away, what is this thing called love? Okay, that's a question about noumena. It's a question about getting to the essence of something. And you notice with Ella, as she's singing it, I can only hear it with Ella singing it. She sings, what's this thing called love? This funny thing called love. Who can solve its mystery? Why should it make a fool of me? And then she has a little story about how it happened. But then she says, but what is it again? And I kind of like to think that Ella Fitzgerald is channeling Socrates here. If you've read the Platonic dialogues, Socrates asks all the questions, and he doesn't dare to answer them because he knows all the answers will be inadequate. But we're going to have a go at it anyway. So you've got about a minute to post in the chat any ideas of your responses to the question, what is this thing called love? So if you open up the chat box on Zoom and have a go. A definition. Okay, so we have life. We have a mystery that gives life meaning. Source, interesting. Anything else? Exploration of our very being. Something that draws us forward without knowing why. A vibration. Oh, lots of interesting ideas. Passion for someone, something. Epigee. Not sure I know what that means. Okay. So, we have here a set of ideas about what love is, a set of answers to Ella and Cole Porter's question. Oh, energy. Okay, that makes more sense. I thought it was some deeply obscure philosophical term I didn't know. Okay, life, inconceivably liberating miracle, magical elixir. Okay, so if you start asking those kind of questions, you often find that it's really quite hard to come to any kind of agreement. You see this in the Platonic dialogues. You see this in everyday life when people are arguing about those everyday ethical issues. You know, what is goodness? Is this a good thing to do or is it not? So when we're trying to seek essence or the noumena or even just definitions, it can be quite hard. So what if we take this question phenomenologically? Okay. So let's move on. So as an experiment, I want you to get phenomenological and to try and describe now, with as much care as you can muster, what love is like. Now here you can go in any direction you like, but we're not talking about defining the essence. We're simply talking about describing it. We're not trading in definitions, but in descriptions, not in some underlying reality, but in appearances. So in the chat, when you're ready, what is this thing called love like? Or just what is love like? Love is like light. Think about paying attention to the experience. So don't try and get too abstract. Again, we're not trying to define, but what is it like? It's a sweet chocolate. Any more? Think back to being in love or having an intense love for somebody, something. What was that like? I'll give you another 30 seconds. Okay. Feel free to keep typing. But hopefully, even just that short exercise, you should have got a feel for the slight difference in flavour of those kind of questions. What is this thing called love? And what is this thing called love like? So the first kind of set of questions, what is this thing called love, or what is X, leads us down a particular road, a particular kind of philosophy towards essences and definitions and noumena, underlying realities. The second leads us down a different path towards appearances, towards descriptions, towards phenomena, perhaps even towards stories. So in the Platonic dialogues, when Socrates asks for a definition of something, justice, and somebody gives a story, Socrates says, no, I'm not asking for a story, I'm asking for a definition. But phenomenology leaves itself open to stories as well. That's a kind of phenomenology. You know, what is love like? Well, I was 22 and I was traveling from Rome to Sorrento, and I met her in the town square, and she was called Florencia. She was from Argentina, and we shared bread and cheese, and then she left and sent a postcard with balconies of Buenos Aires and said, we stand on the balconies and we dream. You know, that's something that love is like. That's a little story, and we all have stories of our own. So phenomenology, one way of thinking about phenomenology is that it leads, it's why it adds to the mess of philosophy, not tidies it up, is it leads to a kind of greater mess of descriptions than that search for definitions does. It leads to a multitude of different ideas, a waterfall of smiles, a lovely sort of simile or metaphor for love there, and bittersweet chocolate. All these other things which are not so much definitions as ways to try and bring ourselves, our sense of the world, and find language that can somehow match our sense for this thing, this mysterious thing. Okay. And one thing about this kind of phenomenological approach is all of these responses to the phenomenological question, what is this thing called love like? They don't necessarily cancel each other out in the way that definitions might. Because they're all data, they all kind of add to the great store of expressions of what this thing is, and they enrich it rather than trying to narrow it down to a single essence. So this is one reason I think that as a rational science and phenomenology was the abject failure. But it's also, I think, why it's been such a productive movement in philosophy, because in asking what are things like, let's pay attention more closely to experience of love, experience of strangers, and of the other person in Levinas, experience of the body in Merleau-Ponty, experience of some of the work Hannah Arendt has done on work and labour, and looking more closely at the actual texture of experience, that leads to an incredibly rich and creative set of fields of inquiry. Okay, so this is hopefully has given you a sense of what phenomenology is doing, asking these questions, what is X like, rather than what is X. And after a little pause for some questions, we're going to move on to look at this when applied to the experience of ethics and the experience of the other person in Levinas's work. But I've probably talked long enough before just having a pause to catch our breath, for me to catch my breath as well, and for you to, if you've got any burning questions at this stage, to ask any of those burning questions before we move on to look at Levinas's phenomenology in particular. So any questions? You can raise a hand or you can put them in the chat. Anybody? Thank you. The art is all, that's a good question. It's also easy to answer. It's all by Paul Klee, the great German painter, and I absolutely love his work. And so it's not particularly matched with the themes of the slides, but they're just incredibly beautiful images and suggestive. Anything that's not clear or puzzling or... So yeah, my dissertation was on Levinas's phenomenology, and it was reading Levinas as against the grain, if you like, as a storyteller of ethics. And Levinas was a writer who was deeply suspicious of storytelling, but that's how I read him, and it was an interesting way to do it. Good. Okay. So there's nothing burning, no burning questions, no burning objections. We all ready to move on? Interesting about love existing outside the human sphere. I fostered 2 cats whilst in Sofia, Bulgaria recently, and the 2 cats, they liked us, they adored us, but they were utterly smitten with each other. It was a thing that was almost painfully beautiful to see, and they would always just be curled up together and grooming each other. And definitely I think I tend to read Levinas in a way that Levinas would be horrified by, and try and root some of what he says in our biological nature as social mammals, and Levinas would be horrified by that, but I don't particularly care about that. And I think you can see that definitely in other living beings as well. And we have Rachel there talking about being in love with her dog, and the feeling is mutual, and definitely the case also with dogs. Is there possibly a question suspicious of the experience of others in contrast with what? Do you want to just clarify that? If there's anything burning there that... No? Okay. If anything pops up or if you're still typing, I'll sort of try and weave it in. I'll keep my eye on the chat. So let's go on and look at Levinas's phenomenological approach to ethics. And I spent quite a long time on phenomenology because I think it's important to understand the method in rough outline to see why Levinas's thinking is so powerful. And also, once we understand the method, it's not just Levinas telling us stuff, it's Levinas trying to provoke in us an attentiveness to a particular thing in our experience. So when we understand that, then it's like Levinas's work is an invitation to test what we're hearing against that own experience. So Levinas is utterly obsessed by ethics. He's preoccupied by human goodness, and no wonder he suffered through some of the most terrible events of the 20th century. And so at the beginning of his great book, Totality and Infinity, published in 1961, he says, the biggest question of all, the question that we're all troubled by and that haunts us at some time or other, is whether we are duped by morality, whether we're tricked by ethics. So in other words, is ethics anything other than a mug's game? This is really what he's asking. In a world which is defined to some extent by the desire to dominate, to master, to win, the war of all against all, the desire to get on, to triumph over your opponents, what space is there for ethics? What is ethics? Is it simply just a failure to get in on the game of domination? Or is there such a thing as goodness? Is goodness something that has some kind of human weight? So, so this is really the question at the beginning of Totality, and excellent. Thank you for that suggestion as well. My Octopus teacher, which I've not seen, but I've heard of, and I'll push up my pile. So this question of whether we're duped by ethics, whether ethics is anything other than a beautiful or an empty dream, is one that Levinas tackles by looking at the question phenomenologically. And this is a smart move, because you can argue for ethics until you're blue in the face, but actually that doesn't, that still remains with that sort of the is-ought kind of divide. It remains with you saying, well, you ought to do this, or this is the thing you should do. But what about experience? What about the awakening of ethics within our experience? Does that actually happen? And if so, well, that's interesting. We should pay attention to that. So I might enrage Levinas scholars by oversimplifying in this, but I think really you can see what Levinas is doing is moving from those what is ethics questions to questions like, what is ethics like? Or what is human experience like, such that we encounter ethical demands? So what is a human experience like, such that we encounter ethical demands? So for somebody like Emmanuel Kant, the philosopher, he talks about the categorical imperative. It's something you should do in all cases, a duty you should always perform, secured by reason. But Levinas is interested in a different kind of imperative, which you could talk about as an experiential imperative. So it's something that is within experience and is unarguably there within experience that puts an ethical demand upon us. It's not something we establish by reason, but it's kind of right there in the meat and the dynamism of our encounter with other people. And by looking at this experiential imperative, Levinas challenges us to explore ethics not just as a set of rules established by reason, a bunch of arbitrary guidelines for living, or process of deciding what the right thing to do is, but as a much more direct experience within the ongoing unfolding of our lives. It's not an abstraction, it's there in the fabric of who we are. And I'm going to share a second story, because this is a story that when I read Levinas, it recurred again and again and again. It's preoccupied me hugely. And it's a story I think that sums up this sense of this ethical imperative that you get there in Levinas's work. So it's a story, it's from my book, Finding Our Sea Legs. ethics experience in the ocean of stories, and it's from right at the beginning, and it's about a trip in the northern part of India. We left the hotel in Darjeeling early, shouldering our bags and heading through the narrow streets to the bazaar where the jeep was waiting. The air was a little chilly and the sun was low over the hills, but already the marketplace was crowded. As we hurried through the crowds, we heard the sound of wailing. There, to the side of the road, by a flight of steps, was a man. He was seated on the ground amid the detritus of the market, sniffed at by mangy dogs. Nobody was paying him any attention. His clothes had slipped away from his upper body to reveal a hollow chest. His ribs stood out starkly in relief. Skinny arms protruded from his rags. He hugged himself with one arm while propping himself up with the other. But it was not his emaciated form that shocked me most. Instead, it was his face I remember, an abyss of distress and misery. We faltered for a moment as he cried out, his face contorted in pain. What would it have taken to have alleviated his suffering? Perhaps the universe, perhaps merely a touch of another human being's hand. Or perhaps he was beyond helping, if there is such a thing. But we were tired and ready for our journey to end. The man was a stranger, not our concern. So we turned away from his suffering. After all, suffering is, as certain Indian texts maintain, as inexhaustible as the ocean, and it seems as little, so very little we can do. Inevitably, there are times we no longer try. In a moment, just long enough for the thought, there is nothing we can do, to take root in our minds, we had turned away. The crowds closed behind us and the man was gone. We headed down the hill to where the jeep was waiting, unloaded our heavy bags, climbed in, and before long we were on our way down the winding road that led to Siliguri, speeding past signs reading, "Arrive home in peace, not in pieces," brackets, Public Works Department, close brackets, and "Don't test your nerves on my curves." Only then, with Darjeeling behind us, as we wound our way down the road by the River Teesta, did my friend speak. "We should have done something," she said. So a couple of decades on, and that memory of that morning still stays with me. We should have done something. We should have done something. And there's no getting around it. There's no way of easily evading that thought. You could ask, yeah, sure, but what? Admitting that we know nothing of his suffering, and we simply don't know what we could have done. But even so, that does nothing to absolve me of the sense I still have of responsibility. Because when it comes down to it, it was really quite simple. We knew enough to act, but we failed to do so. And I can't think of Levinas without thinking of this story, because I think this story lays bare one of the central dramas in Levinas's explorations of what ethics means. So I'm going to sketch out that picture of Levinas's approach to ethics and keep this story of the man in the marketplace in Darjeeling in the back of your mind. And when we've got a sense of what Levinas is up to, then we'll go back to the big overarching theme of this talk and explore the idea of the stranger. Okay, so I've told two stories so far. The first one about meeting the stranger whilst walking along the high street in Leicester in the UK, as it happened, in the week after my partner Ellie's death, and when I encountered a stranger, a charity fundraiser, who did respond to my need. And although I was defensive, although at first I didn't really want to connect, this stranger reached out, they touched my arm, they hugged me, and something in me shifted or changed, lightening a sense of possibility, which I'll come back to later. The story from Darjeeling is a darker one because it's a story about my own failure. It's a story about how a stranger, not about how a stranger responds to my need, but how I fail to respond to the need of another. The man in the marketplace in Darjeeling. It's a story about how in this encounter with this guy in the marketplace, I experienced and still experience, weirdly, a strange, unshakable responsibility for this person I'd never met. This, we should have done something, that still remains with me down to the present. So Levinas has a lot to say about this. And for Levinas, these kind of encounters are really where ethics begins. Ethics doesn't begin in theories about what's good or bad. It doesn't begin in reasoning, but it begins in the direct appearance of somebody else, in the question of what it is like to encounter another human being. And that's obviously a phenomenological question. And for Levinas, in that encounter, what we encounter is a paradoxical quality or set of qualities, which is both, he says, height and destitution. And that may seem a little puzzling, but thinking of the guy in Darjeeling in the marketplace, the height there is the sense that there is a demand upon me that I am subject to, if you like. Thanks for the message, Rachel, and yeah, do catch up with the recording as well. Just been a message in the chat here, but it's been great to have you with us. So there's height and destitution. So the height is this sense of responsibility, which I'm subject to. I didn't choose it. I was just found myself responsible. And the destitution is the fact that there was this abyss of need. Okay. So this is a paradoxical and puzzling, but also everyday kind of experience, I think. And often, I think, when we have these experiences, we attempt to get out of them. We attempt to reason our way out of them. Philosophy is often a way of getting ourselves off the hook. So I might reason to the conclusion that, of course, I couldn't have helped the guy in the bazaar. Okay. I could say, well, you know, I probably couldn't have done anything and might have made it worse. And what did I know anyway? I could have taken all kinds of routes to reason my way out of this nagging sense of responsibility. But however much I do that, the phenomenological fact is the fact of that experience itself, of the height and destitution of this stranger. So this is something that's direct and immediate. Levinas says that our relationship with the stranger is straight away ethical, before reason has a chance to put on its trousers and come and join the party. You know, ethics is already there. Okay. Levinas doesn't say anything about putting on your trousers. But, okay. So let's look more closely at this idea of strangers. What is it like to encounter another person in their heightened destitution? How do we experience this responsibility? And here, Levinas' starting point actually comes from Husserl, his mentor. So Husserl makes the point in Cartesian Meditations, which is the book Levinas translated into French in 1931, so it's all tying together. In Cartesian Meditations, Husserl says that our experience of another person is curious, because we experience them as an object in the world, they're a thing, but we also experience them as a subject. And they're not just a thing on which we might stub our toes, but they have their own subjectivity, their own inner world, inner life, desires, oddnesses, obsessions, thoughts, strangenesses. There's something it's like to be me, but when I encounter you, I encounter a being for whom there's something that it's like to be you as well. And the annoying thing, quite often, and the difficult thing in human social interactions is I have no access to that, what it is like to be you. I have direct access to it with me, but I don't have access to your subjectivity. So Levinas says there's something about the other person, and this comes direct from Husserl, that escapes my grasp by an essential dimension, even if I have the other person at my disposal. We experience others both as a presence, somebody who's there, but that presence involves an absence because we know that all that stuff that's going on with them is not something to which we have direct access. So there's that curious mixture of presence and absence in our experience of another person. And this leads to all of the kind of big dramas of human life, the insecurity of lovers. Tell me you love me, the deeply insecure lover pleads, and the beloved says, I love you. And then the insecure lover says, but tell me you really love me. And the object of their affection says, I really love you. And the more the lover asks the question, the more anxiously they chew on the answers, the more troubled they become, because they can never really have access to that interiority. And no amount of reassurance will overcome their anxiety once it kicks in. Of course, we can speak to each other, and we develop bonds of trust and all kinds of ways around this. But there is that underlying anxiety which can sometimes run riot. I think another example of the way people are present to us but inaccessible, a much darker one, is the horror of torture. So the physical pressure to apply to another person to get them to confess the truth or to change their view. But we can never fully know that it is the truth, that their view really has changed, or that it is sincere. We can never know whether Winston Smith really truly loves Big Brother. I was never convinced by the end of that book, or whether he doesn't. And maybe Orwell meant that. So the game ratchets up, the brutality gets worse as the doubt magnified and the whole grisly process goes on. That whole logic is predicated really upon the fact that people are at our disposal, but also inaccessible to us. So other people, Levinas's contention is, and it seems undeniable, are to some extent all strange to us. They're all strangers in a fundamental sense because their interiority isn't something we can get a hold of. And this means that when I encounter anybody, any other person, I encounter to some extent a limit of my power. My blithe belief that I can master the world is messed with by the fact of other people being there. The world I inhabit is called into question by the fact that it's not just a world that exists for me, but it's a world that exists for somebody else, and I don't have access to that other person's interiority. And this is why, if you've ever worked in a shop, for example, as I did some years ago, people will joke who work in those kind of industries that the shop would be perfectly good and orderly if it wasn't for the customers. Okay, because when you get to customers, there your orderliness is going to meet its ultimate challenge, and you're going to meet with the limit of your power. So for Levinas, that limitation of our power has that double nature of both an ethical demand, and we'll come to that next, and also an ethical need. So when we run into somebody, we are caught between the sense that we have to do something with them, we have to respond to them, there's some kind of obligation on us, but also the sense that there is a need that needs to be met. And Levinas sums this up in his idea of the face of the other, one of his most beautiful and enigmatic ideas, and he talks about the face as an enigma. So when I was talking about the guy in Darjeeling, I said I remember his face, an abyss of misery and despair, or something like that. But what do I remember? I'm not remembering how large his nose was, the tilt of his chin, whether he had long or short earlobes, whether he was bald or not. I'm not remembering any of that. I'm remembering something else. And the face for Levinas really is a way of trying to capture that odd experience of phenomenon, or not quite phenomenon, of what we're encountering when we're in social relationship with somebody. You may all have the experience that you meet with somebody and you get on really well, you just click. You get on really, really well with them, and So you chat for half the evening, and then at the end of the evening, you try and describe them. Oh, I met this great person, blah, blah, blah. Oh, what did they look like? And you have no idea. And you can happily talk about what the other person, who you weren't in a particularly kind of vibrant social relationship with, what they look like. But somehow the person you were speaking to and connecting with, it's hard to say what they looked like even. I mean, maybe in the most general terms, but it's like, did they have grey eyes, blue eyes, green eyes? I can't remember. And this is, I think, quite a common experience, that we alternate between seeing people as objects in the world and as subjects, and we can't really see those two things at the same time. So we switch, and sometimes you can feel that switch happening. You start talking to somebody and you're taking in the fact they look a little bit weird, or, you know, they're very attractive or something else. And then the moment you enter into some kind of deeper social relationship with them, those things fall away and you're encountering something else, something that seems more fundamentally them, but isn't just to do with their physiognomy or what they look like. And this is what Levinas is getting at when he's talking about the face. When you really connect, when you're really in relationship, and it's a connection that is also a connection with distance in, because there is that sense of inaccessibility. But when you encounter the face of another, Levinas says, you don't even notice the colour of their eyes, which I think is such a beautiful and insightful phenomenological observation. So when you have a sense of lose the sense of the other person as object and have the sense of them as subject, then their status as an object begins to fade, and you just relating to them, and all those things like the colour of their eyes, etc., fade away. So, and this for Levinas is a deeper kind of relationship than the relationship to somebody else as an object. So when I think back on that day in the bazaar in Darjeeling, in that sense of being held by the face of the other person, it was that moment of connection, or moment of heightened destitution, again, of ethical obligation, which is somehow deeper than any ideas about what this man who was suffering may have looked like. And in that encounter of the face of with a face of another person, with their subjectivity, with the meeting of a limit of your power, when you're met with the manifestation of their subjectivity, the language here gets a bit complicated with Levinas. There's this sense of responsibility, this demand to do something. So we don't always respond to that demand, of course, as we might hope. So if somebody asks you for money in the street, the demand is there already. You know, somebody's homeless, needs food, ask you for money. The demand is there already. You can ignore them. That's already comes after the demand. You can give them some money. You can respond, or you can do something awkward and halfway in between. But all of these are responses to a prior responsibility that you haven't chosen. Okay. So for Levinas, responsibility that we encounter in the face of the other is the primary fact. So let's talk about Mavis. Okay. Mavis is a neighbour. So she lives next door to you. And this is a deeply disturbing aspect of Levinas, because for Levinas, even if you do assume your responsibilities, that doesn't discharge them, but it deepens them. So imagine, for example, that you're going home and you see your neighbour. You don't like your neighbour. Fair enough, you know, we don't all like our neighbours. Mavis is bad-tempered, and she's struggling on the street with her shopping, and she isn't a particularly pleasant neighbour. But you see her struggling with the shopping, and something something makes you stop and say, can I help? And the moment you say that, you feel a pang of regret because you really wish you'd just gone through your front door. But no, it's too late. You've offered to help because you've experienced that sense of responsibility, that experiential imperative. So you help Mavis with her shopping into the house, and then you take your leave and you escape. And you think, thank goodness that's over. But unfortunately, and this is the thing, it's not over. Because the next time you run into her, it's going to be so much harder not to stop and help her. Your responsibility increases in the measure to which you've assumed it. So next time you bump into Mavis and she sees you with her shopping, you think, I have to help her now. So you take her shopping in and then you start unpacking it for her. And then the next day, you do the same thing again. And by the time the week is out, you're in her living room, drinking weak tea, eating stale biscuits, hearing stories from her distant past. And you're thinking, how the hell did I end up here? How did this even happen to me? And the answer is it happened to you because of the peculiar structure of responsibility that Levinas describes so well. And I think we all know this, that our responsibilities have the habit of increasing ever more rapidly as we assume them. And for this reason, we are, as Levinas claims, infinitely responsible to the other person. It goes on and on and on and on. It gets deeper and deeper and deeper. This, as we'll see, is one reason that we're wary of connecting with strangers in the first place, I think. This curious structure of responsibility that increases in the measure to which it's assumed. But before we move on to that and finish by talking about strangers, that's a rough overview of Levinas and what he's up to and his, I think, relatively compelling picture of what it means to encounter our fellow human beings. But are there any questions for clarification? There's one in the chat already. So maybe I'll start with that, and if you've got any more questions, haven't got the window up for seeing people's hands raised. But, okay, I'll start with Liz's question, and then we'll go from there. So responsibility to the other predicated on responsibility as a self. Levinas actually does a much more radical thing, I think, where he says that the responsibility to the other, to some extent, is a kind of invests us with, what's the term he uses? Consecrates us as a self, if you like. So it's in that responsibility for another person that we fully come into our own. The issue I think you might be kind of going onto there, and it's an issue that's absolutely kind of crucial, is, but surely we can't be infinitely responsible to everyone. If we don't take responsibility for ourselves, then we spend all of our life, at Mavis's next door, but then what about our own family, our own friends, our grandkids, our parents, the other people who need us? How do you balance those responsibilities? For Levinas, just a short version is that we're actually infinitely responsible to all others, which is a kind of like terrifying from one point of view. And the work of deciding how to respond to that infinite array of responsibilities is the work of justice. And so he talks a lot about justice. For Levinas, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because there's always something else you can do. It's, he quotes the famous line, Rabbi Tarfon, "You're not called upon to complete this task, but neither are you free to evade it." So there's always more stuff to do. And actually there's a kind of freedom in that as well. The way I think of it in a more down-to-earth way is that there's always an opportunity to be freed from the circle of your own slightly narrow self-concern by the approach of another person. And that's kind of possibly a good thing. I mean, Levinas calls it the glory of an infinite desire, but there's a text by Shantideva, the Buddhist Mahayana philosopher who got me into Levinas, and he talks about the bodhisattva, the one who's committed to liberation for all beings, as a joyful kind of existence where you're plunging from one, like an elephant, from one cool pool to another in the summer. And there's a kind of joy in that responsiveness. So there are difficult questions there to do with how you manage a multitude of infinite responsibilities. But I kind of think Levinas is right about it. So yes, Valian, do you have a question? Is that a nice thought?
You're still unmuted. Still muted, Valjean.
Valjean, sorry.
Yeah, microphone. Yes, I just wondered, what if old Mavis is somebody who reciprocates and, you know, leaves you her house or something like that? I mean, what does Levinas say about that? That there's a possibility then of reciprocation, no?
I mean, good for you if she does. That's what I would say. But for Levinas, in a sense, what the other person's responsibilities are their own affair, he says. So that's kind of not my business. And phenomenologically speaking, I think he's right. In terms of justice and in terms of what collectively we might do and decide upon, then there is a kind of collective thinking through of how we organize ourselves. But at the most basic level, Levinas, I think, would say that's Mavis's own affair. So she's infinitely responsible for you as well. Whether she does anything about that or not is up to her. So you have in Levinas a kind of a mirror image of two infinite responsibilities that don't necessarily don't at all cancel each other out. So that gives it's an incredibly dynamic picture of what it means to encounter another person. I do think actually reciprocity matters. It's clearly really important in human life. I'm not sure. One of my arguments with Levinas is that he's identified one thing that goes on in our interpersonal relationships that's really interesting. Mm-hmm. But as a phenomenologist, he's also been blind to other things going on, which are equally interesting. And so I think that my own view would modify Levinas's sort of hardline view, or wouldn't reduce everything down to this. So it's a really good question, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, Alan.
Yes, sorry, my camera isn't working. I hope you can hear me.
That's fine. We can definitely hear you.
Yeah, a very sort of basic question. It strikes me that we don't help the stranger because we feel, or at least I think I would feel, I don't know how to communicate, to connect, to meet the stranger in the first place. I think that's even true, can be true in social settings, in terms of the kind of conversations one has. They tend to be very sort of, well, not very interesting really. What do you do as a typical starting point? So my question is, can you, what advice would you give from your own experiences of how to actually meet, communicate and engage with the stranger, with somebody you really don't know?
Okay. Can you remind me of that question sort of towards the end? Because I'm going to be talking quite a bit about strangers for the last 15 or so minutes before a few more questions. And I think that might, not to fully sort of anticipate what I'm going to say then, but also that kind of practical thing might be really useful at that stage. So are you okay to hold on with that question?
Yeah, of
Great,
course.
good.
Thank you.
Remind me, because it may have sort of march into my mind and march out the other side. So do remind me as well. Okay, just have a quick look. So I think there's a nice comment about built-in collective aspect to our individuality. I think, not thinking in terms of Levinas, but I think I would agree with that we're primarily social. And I think all of the evidence is that we're primarily social, and that to the extent that we court solitude, for example, that's a modification of our social being rather than us being primarily and fundamentally solitary. That's something I talk about quite a lot when I'm talking about loneliness in Hello Stranger. And nice comment from Liz about connecting with the whole, growing in awareness. And I think also, Marie-France, so the idea of love as a verb of action, very much for Levinas, I think it's kind of all about action, actually. So it's all about the dynamics, rather than a sort of static state. So yeah, I think that's a point well made. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about strangers, because that will sort of bring us full circle, and then we will have time for Alan's question and also some more questions. So, okay. So there's lots of, if everybody's a stranger, and even if you disagree with Levinas and his idea that there's an essential strangeness to everyone from that phenomenological point of view, even then, we're in a situation where there's 8 billion people on the planet, and there's probably, according to Robin Dunbar, the anthropologist, about 150 who we could call our intimates. So the proportion of the percentage of human beings who are not strangers to us is vanishingly small. We live in a world where pretty much everybody is a stranger. Okay. And I'm really interested, and this came partly from my reading of Levinas, but I'm really interested in what we do about that. So one thing that I think is really interesting and that Levinas captures is the strange, almost quiver, the double sort of tension between two conflicting things in our relationship with strangers. So on the one hand, strangers freak us out. Okay, this is true not just of human animals, it's true of your cat. If you have depends on the cat, but it's true of cats to some extent. If somebody new comes to the house, they hide behind the sofa and peer out. Okay, it's true of babies. Babies fear strangers, particularly male strangers, and there's interesting questions of gender which we probably don't have time to get into. And fear of strangers is very much rooted in who we are. Fear, not just as outright hatred, which is often how xenophobia is read, but as caution, as uncertainty, as hesitation. Okay. And there are lots of reasons that might be the case. There's the obvious reasons that we think about, that strangers are possibly going to harm us. They're going to do terrible things to us. So there's part of the fear of strangers is a fear of what might become of us, and that's understandable and not unreasonable. It's not as if xenophobia is always a should be seen as a fault that should be eradicated, because it's, I think, probably ineradicable. We're all uneasy to some extent with something that is novel and new, and that's a relatively sensible position to take. But there's a more subtle aspect of our fear of strangers that I think Levinas draws out. It's not just a fear of what might become of us, but it's a fear of what we might become. And this is something I've been incredibly interested in, and that was I was exploring a lot when writing Hello Stranger and when thinking about my own experience, the way that we're afraid of what our lives might become if we let somebody in. We're afraid of the fact that strangers open futures for us, and in those futures we may find ourselves different from how we are now. We're afraid of ending up on madcap missions that we hadn't anticipated, that are frankly inconvenient, but we're also afraid, and we're afraid of being harmed, of course, but we're also afraid of becoming other than who we now are. So there's this double fear: what will become of us and what will we become? And I think, to come back to the title of this talk series, in times of crisis, this fear of strangers multiplies manyfold. So when our resources are gone, the future is terrifying. When we're facing a time of crisis, xenophobia has a tendency to take hold more firmly. After Ellie's death, which is obviously at the beginning of Hello Stranger, I noticed how very strongly I became more hesitant of strangers rather than less. I was afraid of what might become of me. I was afraid of what I might become. I didn't want, enough had gone on. Frankly, I didn't want anything else. I just wanted to hide away and to shut the doors and batten down the hatches. So we want, in times of crisis, very often to nurse our grief, to protect ourselves from further harm. And there's a lot of wisdom in that desire as well. And there are times when we definitely need to do that. But also, I think it's really worth heeding the idea from Levinas that here there's not just threat, but also the possibility of something new, something anticipated, the future we could not have anticipated alone, that we encounter in the face of the stranger. So I want to talk about this in the last part of the talk, and I'm going to finish with a reading, and then we'll have time for some questions. Okay. So the title of this talk was about the love of wisdom and the wisdom of love. And Levinas talks about philosophy as the wisdom of love because, in a sense, that dynamism of the interpersonal relationship, when we're talking about in the chat just now, love being something that's dynamic, is the primary fact. Okay, and then wisdom, philosophy, puts on its trousers, as I said earlier, and comes to join the party later. First, the interpersonal connection, first responsibility for the other, first the face of the other, and then philosophy on the basis of that. So Levinas reverses these terms and talks about philosophy as the wisdom of love. And I think one thing that's lovely about that is, if you think about the love of wisdom, you imagine somebody sitting on a broken Greek pillar, looking into the distance, musing upon abstract mathematical concepts, perhaps, if they're a Greek philosopher, and you imagine that as philosophy. But the idea of the wisdom of love, I think, gives a different, more phenomenological approach to philosophy, where you're plunging into the complexities of human experience with enough love and attentiveness and care as you can, and then you're seeing how from that you can think and act and reason and provide justifications and arguments with greater wisdom, but also in a way that is expressive of that love. So in the final few moments, I want to introduce a term that comes from Greek that you may be familiar with, and that brings to light another aspect of our relationship with strangers, something other than xenophobia. It's an aspect that's there by implication in Levinas, but he doesn't fully draw out. And that is the term philoxenia, or love of the stranger. It appears a lot in the New Testament, which talks a lot about love of the stranger, but it can be found back as far as Homer, and it's still used in contemporary Greece to talk about hospitality and about openness to others. So in Hello Stranger, one of the things I'm talking about a lot, and one of the things I think is really central to our relationship with strangers and to how we think through this, is that this is not simple. We relate to strangers on the basis of a cocktail of both curiosity or love or fascination or desire to connect, and fear or hatred sometimes, or unease or desire to withdraw. And as any reader of old folk tales will know, this is entirely understandable because strangers open futures we can't anticipate, and that means they bring both opportunity and threat. So if there's a knock on the door and a stranger comes calling, was it Bilbo Baggins who found this out at the beginning of The Hobbit, which I read years ago? You better be ready for anything. It could launch you on any kind of quest. So I started this story with a talk about a hug from this talk with a story about a hug from a stranger. And back then I was wounded, I was hurt, I was consumed by grief so raw I didn't know what to do with it. It had been a terrible, terrible week at the end of a terrible, terrible year. And as I stumbled along the high street there in Leicester, I couldn't see beyond that evening, the next day, the day after. That stopping up that comes with grief and crisis, that stopping up of the future. Then up came the stranger, said hello, and she was entirely outside my world and my preoccupations. And when she asked me, what was your partner's name? And I told her Ellie's name, that felt like it was a moment of incredible transformation, although it was quite small. And I broke down and sobbed into her shoulder. And in that moment, I had a sense that here there is perhaps a way beyond that paralysis of grief that makes the future impossible. The way that, as Levinas wrote, the stranger opens time for me and offers futures we couldn't have anticipated. And after that encounter, she obviously went back to her work, and I went back, and a friend donated a bike to replace a stolen one, and I got on with my life and trying to see what I could do with this new situation, this sense that I needed to rethink and rebuild my future. But there was a sense after that encounter that the future was again possible. It was one of the things that contributed so strongly to that shift where suddenly the future became possible again. So this is what I want to leave you with, really. The idea that for all the challenges of encountering strangers, for the responsibilities that press upon us, there's an opportunity here for newness, for new futures, for unexpected passages through and beyond our present difficulty. The responsibility we encounter in the face of another, and I do agree with Levinas that it's a responsibility, is a difficult thing. No wonder we want to run away. But it's also a kind of gift that invests us with a kind of freedom, as we were talking about earlier when we were chatting. So I'm going to end with a short reading from the end of Hello Stranger about opening the door a little wider and love in the time of crisis. And then, as we started a bit late, we should have a good 10 minutes or so for questions. Okay. By the summer, we knew it wasn't going to be 3 years. It wasn't even going to be 2. By then, Ellie was in a wheelchair, her skin sallow. We had long given up on our plans to visit Copenhagen, and we settled for a weekend in Oxford instead. We booked a room just out of town. Most of the time, Ellie slept. It was the weekend of the Brexit result. I read books and looked anxiously at the news. I went for short walks, brought back things to eat. We tried to make it feel like a holiday, not a farewell. We went to the Museum of Natural History, where Ellie had done her research. In the evening, we watched an indifferent, forgettable film. Afterwards, we went to a Japanese restaurant to eat. Ellie no longer had any taste for food, and it was hard to manhandle the wheelchair up the steps. But we drank beer and ate gyoza, and it was good. On the train home the following day, I watched Ellie sleep exhausted in her wheelchair. I knew it would be our last trip. Then, on the first day of August, Ellie was gone, and the day after, I sat alone in the house we had shared, fussing the cat, not knowing what to do with myself. A week after Ellie's death, a friend from London put a message on Facebook. He had to move out of his apartment, he said. He was looking for a place. He was not quite a stranger, but we didn't know each other well. I sat at the dining room table thinking about the emptiness of my home, how it had always been peopled. It would have been easy to keep the doors closed, to go into retreat, to hug my loss close. But something instinctive told me there was an opportunity here, a lifeline. I fired off a message. Move in, I said, there's a spare room. My friend arrived exactly 1 week after Ellie's funeral with a van full of stuff. And it was good in the weeks that followed, when the world seemed utterly broken, to have someone else around, to feel the walls of the house expanding outwards again. My friend cooked up Chinese feasts. We invited people over to eat. As the autumn turned to winter, we ate and drank and sat by the gas fire. The doorbell rang often. The house became clamorous. Another friend brought over stacks of Motown records. We opened bottles of wine, put on the records and danced. And in this way, I started to restitch the torn fabric of my world. Thank you. Okay. So that's all I have to say, I think. So we have probably a nice sort of 10 minutes, possibly a bit more for any questions. So it would be great to get chatting.
Could I remind you of my question then, please?
Alan, yes. Okay. So the question is about practical ways of connecting. You put it better than I can, so remind me.
Yes, connecting, meeting, engaging with the person as well, quite deeply, as opposed to the sort of superficial conversations that one so easily engages in, goes for.
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's not something that anybody's asked me before in relation to the book, and I'm trying to think of how it happens. So I'm sort of trying to get phenomenological about it and think, what is it about an encounter that leads to that, and what is it that when I have encounters where I leave feeling it's somewhat superficial, or it hasn't gone that deep. I mean, from one point of view, gone.
Well, just one thought that just came to my mind was how quickly we form opinions about the other person. I mean, just so quickly, and those opinions could be completely wrong, but we make judgments so easily, and they can be so binding in everything that follows. So that's just one thing to, I'm guessing, at least allow that not to hold sway, forming judgments too quickly.
I think that's I think that's really that's really good, actually, and it chimes in also with the reminding yourself that you actually don't know this person, that your judgments are clearly based on very, very little, and that sense of the inaccessibility of what makes them them, so that very often, my judgments on people are just way off the mark. I noticed years ago when I was traveling, interestingly, and I was traveling in Pakistan, I think, and my initial response to everybody I met, and I was always quite friendly, but for a flicker, the initial response was always a voice in my head saying, I don't like them. And, it shocked me when I realized it every single time. And then when I noticed it, I saw it every single time. Don't like you, don't like you. And it could be any reason at all, but it was clearly that sense of defensiveness and fear and vulnerability. So I think being aware of those responses, because I wonder what comes before the judgments we make as well. So whether there is a kind of, whether you can reel it back to the point of vulnerability that the judgment is there to cover over. I mean, another practical thing that's a little less getting into deep psychological waters. People love talking about what they've had for dinner. It's when I teach writing classes, and so Hannah, my partner now, she's very good at connecting with people, and it's often we think that meaningful connection involves raising meaningful topics with people, but actually very often I think in terms of connecting with people, chatting about dinner, chatting about pets and things feels less superficial in some ways than getting more obviously deep. So I think just and maybe that's because it's a degree of care and attention just to the fine grain of somebody's life, and that's a lovely thing.
One other thing that comes to mind, and that is some advice I was given once, which I'd actually forgotten, and that is, meet the other person as if for the first time, because then you'll still not have the sort of baggage from the past. You could have met somebody once on a bad day, and that actually stays with you every single time you meet that person. But can I just press you just slightly more?
Yeah.
I'm still thinking about the stranger in the bazaar, the person who needed help. Now, I can imagine deciding to give that person a little bit of money or some money, because that, in a way, would make me feel I've responded without really engaging with the other person.
Yeah.
It's doing something, but really very, very much up to a limit and not beyond the limit.
Yeah.
Because it strikes me the need is to connect and engage and find out what the need is. Mm-hmm. So again, I really don't quite know, how would one approach that person? Because I believe your friend said, you should have done something.
Yeah.
So I suppose in a way I'm asking, what should you have done?
And I think that sense of should have done something wasn't born out of an idea of what we could have done, but just a recognition that there was a demand. We do the thing that Levinas recognizes with the idea of justice, that we do actually ultimately have to decide. We do ultimately have to. We're always going to ethically fail to some extent, but is that a bad thing? Well, I quite like that. I quite like the idea that you're always ethically falling short all over the place, because if you look at it from a more optimistic point of view, there's always more that can be done, and it's good to do good stuff. So I don't know what we could have done, and I know that one of the things that I was fearful of then, and I'm fearful of when I am faced by those kind of responsibilities, is where this thing might lead. And there is a good reason for that, but also I think it's being aware of those dynamics is really, really interesting. And part of the thing that I've learned from Levinas really is that he encourages us to live with that ethical discomfort, and that the discomfort is not a sign that there's something wrong. Maybe it's a sign there's something right, actually.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. I think that would, I mean, just approaching such a situation really with the attitude of not minding if it all fails or goes wrong, not actually minding failure or caring about failure, would actually make one far more open and prepared to try things. And I actually think, yes, I think that'd make a big difference.
Yeah, so the idea we've always already failed,
Yeah.
you know, and then, well, the only way is up. So there's a nice question about the Levinas and the inner stranger. In his later work, which gets even more tangled and convoluted, he starts to explore this sense of our strangeness to ourselves as well, and how that relates also to our the stranger who we encounter, the strangers we encounter in the face of the other person. So yeah, absolutely is the short answer to that. The Ekman stuff is really interesting. I know some people have done work on Levinas and Ekman as well, and I think all that kind of thing is valuable. Just flipping through the chat comments. So that's a really interesting comment from Marie-France about consciously holding back from another personal love relationship, not for fear of a future, not by attachment to the past, but to honor the still felt love beyond death. And I think that's very, very much, you know, I know people for whom that's very much true. When I was 18 in Pakistan, I stayed in Karachi with the mother of a school friend of mine, and her husband had died when she was about 21, and she'd just given birth to my friend Zen, and then he was killed in the East-West Pakistan War. And she said to me, she always used to call me Willie, and she said, Willie, people always tell me I should remarry, and you know, I don't want to remarry. I love one man, he died, so what? I still love him, and I'm just getting on with my life, and you know, and that's still important to me. And I still remember that, because I think it was just she was obviously irritated by that idea about what she should do, and also she clearly had this this sense of I think, as you're saying in the chat, honouring the still felt love beyond death, and it was a beautiful thing. So absolutely. Okay, the other. So some nice thoughts from Zoe there. The Buddhist aspects of this are all quite buried, but my PhD started as an attempt to read Levinas and Buddhism against each other. Ended up being Levinas and storytelling, but the inspirations behind it were very much Buddhist. So, okay, Ramona, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment. You can hear me?
Yeah.
You know, this past week, we've been here in Texas, we've been inundated, and obviously in the world as well, by this shooting of these 19 wonderful children in Uvalde, Texas. And then these, while a whole series of, a whole cadre of policemen were standing right outside the door, listening to this entire incredible situation unfold, with the children, of course, using their phones to call for help and saying, we can hear you from outside, you know. And there were also 2 teachers there, and I'm thinking about your work and the understanding of these warriors trained to encounter the stranger, but apparently en masse afraid in some way, shape, or form to enter, even as a collective, to engage with a young 18-year-old machine gun carrying personage. But we're, I guess, aghast or all together fearful of the consequences to themselves or their collective strength, that they couldn't overcome that fear and engage with this situation in the hope of saving these children. And I wondered, based on your own experiences, of what you would say they're going to be going through and thinking about as they begin to digest their lack of action, engaging with this situation.
Thanks, Liz, for comment on sharing screen. Just stop that. One moment. That's a sorry, I'm just trying to.
The share screen is off now.
Oh, it is off. Great, good. I think I was trying to turn it off and it already was off. It's such a horrible and terrible situation, and I always hesitate to kind of find too ready sort of philosophical responses to something that's also so very, very, very raw as well. There's an interesting thing in Levinas where he talks about the saying and the said, the ethical demand to say something, and the knowledge that whatever you say will be inadequate to the situation, and that gap between the what's said being inadequate, but the demand, the ethical demand for the saying of it. I think, I mean, focusing on just that last part of your question with the sense of having failed in something so terrible, and having not acted, and then after the event having that sense of responsibility for what happened, and processing, why didn't we act, and what that must mean for you as a human being, is that must also be incredibly sort of humanly painful. I don't really know beyond that what to quite how to respond to that question. Yeah, I might just leave it there, I think.
Thanks.
Good. And thank Liz as well, the mother who arrived handcuffed and then convinced them to release her. She rescued her children. So yeah, it's a incredibly terrible story. But any other questions?
I think we are sort of approaching the end of the session anyway. Firstly, I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you have anything else just to leave us for this session just before we go?
I don't think so. I mean, do also, I'm always interested if anybody has any further thoughts. Do send an email or tweet me or anything, because it's always good to get into conversation. But thank you very much for the invitation as well. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thanks for all of your patience at the beginning whilst the gods of technology were causing havoc over here.
Great. Well, thank you. It really has been a wonderful session. Quite moving as well with your own personal stories, and just even the content was really appropriate and really, really interesting to listen to. Also, thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for contributing with your questions in the chat or even by just listening. But yes, this is also the last session of this series. I want to thank you all for your continued attendance. I want to thank all the speakers who have contributed to this session, but also Eleanor, who has been sort of bringing everything together, making sure that these sessions have been running smoothly, and everyone who's basically helped behind the scenes with this. Just before we go, I'd just like to announce and invite you all to our next big online series here at the Party Center, which will be the second installment of last year's summer series, Beyond Bohm, a 3-week course looking at the work of David Bohm and its developments with contemporary scholars. Each weekend, we will have different themes, which will be discussed in a series of roundtable discussions, attended by people who either know Bohm academically or past colleagues, people who knew him personally. On the first weekend, we will be discussing imagination. In the second, we'll be looking at creativity and the artistic process. On the third weekend, we'll be looking at dialogue. These sessions will run between the 9th and 24th of July, so I hope to see you all then. I'm just going to put a link on the chat for this event. And we also have our first face-to-face event starting next week. So I know a few of us will be traveling to Pori to be together again after 2 long years. So yes, thank you all again for joining us. If you want to contact us, you can contact us on email at eleanor@parcenter.com to contact Eleanor, otherwise on our website. But in the meantime, thank you all again. We'll see you again soon here at the Party Center.
Thank you. Bye-bye.